Good day, folks. Welcome back to the channel. My name is Alan from season 10 of Alone. Today's video, Alone, season 11, episode 8 recap. Let's get started. There are 4 people remaining in the game as we begin this episode on day 30. Episode 8 starts out with timber. You can really see by looking at the surrounding area that it's cold, the temperatures are really dropping, and it's apparent that winter is coming. Now, Timber is worried about the period of time between now and freeze up, where there's ice forming on the edge of the river, and Dub's worried about this too. And there's going to be a period of 2 weeks or so until the river freezes solid enough to walk on where you can't fish. So he really wants to ensure he gets as much fish as possible, I guess, to supplement his lean moose meat with a little bit more fat. So he heads down to the river to check his set lines, and he finds a 20-inch plus pike on the end of one of his lines. He retrieves it. So instead of killing the pike, Timber employs a new food preservation technique by tethering the fish on a piece of cordage and tying it to a stake. The idea being that the fish will survive in the water attached to this cord, and whenever he wants to collect the fish, he can come down and do it at any time. I don't know about you guys, but I was nervous. When he's tethering this fish, I'm like, oh, I was kind of worried that something is going to get it. I mean, he put it in deeper water to prevent the eagles from seeing it, but there's a lot of other critters that are pretty smart and really good at knowing where to get food. I was thinking of otters, like a river otter would easily locate that fish and rip it off that cord in like 2 seconds. So Timber mentions he's completely living on fish right now. So it's day 30, he wants to have a little celebration meal. So he's having fish fried in moose fat, and that actually sounds pretty good. Timber's next scene is collecting a very large pike, like a 40+ inch pike, and it was thick, it was massive. It's got to be one of the biggest fish caught on Alone. I couldn't believe the size of the thing and how healthy and just robust this fish looked. It was very impressive. So instead of clubbing that fish, he also tethers that fish, ties it to a stake, and releases it back into the water so he can collect it at a later date. Again, I was nervous as he was doing that, and I'm sure the audience was thinking, oh, just kill it and smoke it or put it in your cooler or something, because there's so many things out there that want to eat your food. So Timber left his camera running in camp, and every time he left to take care of whatever he was taking care of, there was a gray jay that would fly down to his camp and eat some of the fat that he had in one of his little dishes. And those gray jays, they're nicknamed camp robbers for a reason. Timber realizes something is getting into his food cache. He holds up a piece of a pike that he caught earlier, and it had been nibbled on by something, presumably rodents, and he realizes that he has to build a more secure food cache, and he gets to work on that. So this new food cache that Timber makes, it was actually a really good idea. Very solid looking, like had a log cabin exterior, and he draped over his old moose hide, first side in, and made like a container out of the moose hide, just like a suspended moose hide cooler. And he built a really secure lid with interlocking logs. And then he made a notch in the 2 trees on either side and kind of wedged down the top with a log holding the lid in place. It did look actually really secure. Because it's getting so cold, the river is starting to freeze up on the edges, and Timber got worried that as the ice was freezing and his tethers were maybe hanging over the edge of the ice, that as those pike were kind of moving around, that it might cut his line. So he heads down to the river to check it or make sure things are okay. And he notices that the tether holding that 40-inch plus pike was gone. Timber thought it might have been a river otter that stole his fish. He had a hard time determining what happened because the mud was frozen and he was unable to find any tracks or evidence left by whatever may have stolen this pike. Luckily, his other fish is still on the tether, and he wisely removes it, processes it, and puts it in his food cache. So it's day 32, and they show all the contestants left waking up to a winter wonderland. I mean, there's good and bad things too when winter hits. I mean, probably the best thing is that the snow leaves evidence of all the small game and large game movement all around your area. It's really easy to see what trails the rabbits are using, where the squirrels are going, and it gives you a lot more information to set your snares. Back in season 10, I clearly remember when winter hit. It was day 49. I remember going to bed that night. I'd had a good day. I'd got 2 lake trout and a grouse. And I remember waking up that next morning, and it had snowed and it had turned very cold. And I remember kind of I had this change mentally, because from day 49 or day 50 all the way to the end of my experience out there, it was like gray, cold, and white. There was no reprieve to winter from day 50 onwards, and I kind of had a mental switch. It wasn't a positive mental switch, because everything was like there was no more colors, and everything seemed to be just in black and white. And I remember feeling a little bit of loss of that kind of positive attitude. And day 50 for me is when the grind kind of really started, and I had to really try to keep my mental game strong by staying positive. Timber's next scene is him scaring a mink away that's investigating his new food cache. He was obviously trying to find a way in. And he makes note of how this cold weather, even though, you know, it's harder to keep warm, obviously, but it relieves the stress for food preservation, because in the cold, obviously, everything is going to last much longer, and that worry of your food spoiling is gone. He then has a run-in with a pine marten. Now, to discourage this pine marten from returning and to get him away from his food cache, he uses his bear banger to scare the pine marten away. So every contestant is given a bear banger with quite a few pieces of ammunition for it. We're supposed to use it for bears, but I guess you can use it for other critters as well. I remember I used it kind of as a celebratory thing on my birthday. I waited till it was pitch dark and I shot one up in the air, just kind of to celebrate my birthday. I've said it many times before, but anything you can do to elevate your mood and keep you positive is a really important thing to do out there, because the mental game at this point is super important. So Timber's next scene is down at the river. And you'll remember that a few days previously, he lost that large pike that he caught from his stringer. And he thought that a river otter might have taken it. And he notices the stick that he had lodged in the riverbank, holding the tether in place, was floating in the middle of the river. Like, what a lucky break. And he was just hoping that the pike was still on the other end of it. So he gets a long pole and he actually retrieves the stick, pulls it in. Lo and behold, the pike is still on the end, perfectly alive and healthy. He retrieves it. What a stroke of luck for Timber. And he decides to dispatch it and process it and get it in his food storage ASAP. What a lucky break for Timber. Timber's next scene is in his shelter, and he's struggling with his fireplace. He's having a hard time getting the smoke to draft properly out the hole he's left at the top of his shelter. And he realizes that this is a pretty big problem and he needs to solve it ASAP. Because obviously you can't live in a shelter with that much smoke being retained inside. And this is probably Timber's first little misstep in all his scenes so far, because he's been solid. Everything he's done has worked very, very well. And I'm quite certain Timber will figure out a solution to his smoke problem. Next up on the episode is William. William starts talking about how he wants to reduce the amount of calories that he's burning each day. He said he's going to sleep in a little longer, lay around a little bit more, maybe go to bed a bit earlier. He's realized that he's lost quite a bit of weight, and up on the screen it states that he has lost 40 pounds so far. So William heads down to the river, and it's nice seeing William, because he's always like so grateful and thankful of the beauty that surrounds him, and he notices it a lot, and he just takes it all in. And I think that has a lot to do with the positive attitude that he's been able to maintain so far in the game. So he heads down to his food cache that he's got hanging in the tree, kind of like extended on a stick over the bank. And as he heads down there, he sees Sassy, the marten, scaling this pole, and it doesn't seem to be scared of William at all. And it crawls down on his fish bag and starts chewing and gnawing at the gaiters that he's fashioned into a bag, trying to get into his fish. He grabs a pole, he ends up scaring Sassy away. He retrieves the fish. Some of it is a little bit damaged. He got a little bit of it. Sassy ate a little bit of it, and they show him cooking it up, and he mentions he's going to cook it a little bit more to make sure that any bacteria or disease or whatever might be transmitted onto his fish from Sassy is eliminated in the boiling process, just to make sure that he doesn't catch anything that marten might have. William is pictured boiling up some snow, and he talks about how he loves the snow because it leaves, again, a story of what's happening around his camp, which will help him be more effective setting snares, because it'll show all the evidence of where the animals are moving in the snow. William heads out to check his rabbit snares. Unfortunately, all his rabbit snares are empty, and he mentions that he thinks he's caught the only 3 rabbits living in his area, so he's feeling a little bit discouraged. He heads down to the river to check his beaver snare. Now, I got kind of confused at this part, because he seemed really upset that he had this beaver in the snare, but I'm thinking, William, you caught a beaver, that's awesome. He was upset, I learned after a couple seconds watching the scene, he was upset because he caught what's called a papoose, which is a young, small beaver, and he was hoping for a large beaver to give him all that fat and meat and grease and energy that he's after. But after he got over the initial disappointment, he became quite excited that he caught any beaver in his trap. So he dispatches it and cleans it up and processes it and brings it up to his kind of rock encampment that he has there. I think that's like his day use area. And he builds a small little rock cache against the cliff. He digs out a little hole, puts the beaver meat inside, and he starts burying it with rocks. I don't know about you guys, but I'm like, William, please just eat it. Just eat the beaver, because he has been struggling with critters stealing all his food. So I know you felt the same way I did. I was just a little bit surprised that William wasn't like just eating it or smoked it or something, because I was just nervous that something else is going to break into his cache and eat that delicious fatty beaver meat. William's next scene is boiling up that beaver head, and he enjoys some delicious beaver head stew. Up next on the episode is Dub. His first scene is having a close encounter with an owl, and I was surprised how close he got to that owl before it took off, but pretty cool experience. He heads down to the river to check his gill net, and he's really noticing that the river is continuing to get lower, and he's concerned that soon the river will be so low that it's going to make fishing more and more difficult. He checks his gill net, and unfortunately there's nothing in his gill net. He sets up 2 set lines, and he's on the bank, just kind of waiting, watching, just taking it all in, and he hears a noise across the riverbank. And moments later, a large bull moose appears, turns, and starts walking towards him on the other side of the river. Super exciting scene, because I thought that he might get a shot at this moose, and the moose seems totally unaware that Dub is even there, and he's considering taking a shot, but it appeared it was 50-ish yards away, which if you're a traditional bow hunter, that is too far to take a shot with a traditional bow. Even the best traditional bow hunters that practice all the time and are very, very proficient with their traditional archery equipment, usually 30 yards would be the maximum distance with a traditional bow. Even though Dub said he could probably hit it, I totally respect Dub for making the right decision and not risking a marginal shot on a large, magnificent animal like that moose. So instead of taking the shot, he follows it down the river, and he does a series of calls, hoping to get the moose to cross the river and swim towards him. Unfortunately, the moose continues on his travels downriver. It seemed like it was on a beeline, like it was on a mission. It knew where it was going. It did stop, turn and look at him at one point when he was calling, but it kept going on its path, and it turned off into the bush, and we haven't seen that. We never saw that moose again that episode. But when there's a bull moose like that in the area, especially during the rut, I'm not sure what the actual date is, but it appeared that it's probably still rutting, and there's a chance that he might get another crack at that moose. Dub's next scene is him checking his snares. Unfortunately, he finds them empty, but he does notice some beaver activity with the fresh snow giving that information, and he decides to set a beaver snare on the trail going into the water. As he's setting the snare, scary situation happens. Dub slips and falls into the river. It doesn't really show how much of him was submerged in the water, but it appeared that most of him got pretty wet. When it's hovering around 0, around the freezing mark, and you're soaked in freezing cold water, you've only got a certain amount of time to get those wet clothes off and warm up. So he decides to finish setting the snare, even though he'd fallen in the water. So he sets the snare up, and he said he's about a mile back to camp. So it does appear that he's getting the early stages of hypothermia, which is like a little bit of disorientation. He says he kind of gets lost in an alder thicket, and I think the Times said on the television that it took him almost 2 hours to get back to his shelter. So even if he had called in for help, they're still 45 minutes away to get to his site. So it is a bit of a scary, dangerous situation when you're out there. Luckily, he made it back to his shelter, stripped off his wet clothes, lit a fire, and obviously was able to warm himself up. I love the next few scenes here. After Dub warms up, he heads out of his shelter. It's probably the next day or so. And he looks up in the sky, and there's like this cloud that looks exactly like the head of a fish, and he takes it as a good omen. And he was right. Dub heads down the river to check his gill net, and he finds an odd fish in his gill net. Now, the fish that he caught is called an inconnu. Now, inconnu is a French word for unknown. And I think it dated back to the early French explorers where they caught this fish and they didn't know what kind of fish it was, so they named it an inconnu, which is like means the unknown fish. So it's kind of cool. It's a type of carnivorous whitefish, and years ago, when I lived in Fort Nelson, British Columbia, I was fishing with a couple buddies, Warren and Jesse. Now, Warren, if you're watching this, I think you'll remember this. And my friend Jesse caught one of these fish, an inconnu, and Warren identified it, and he couldn't believe it because they're pretty rare, and you don't see too many of them up in that area of the province. So, yeah, that's the first time I'd ever seen one, and since that time, many years ago, I've never heard of anyone catching one, so it was kind of cool. It brought me back to my days in Fort Nelson. Yeah, cool story, Al. Later, Dub catches another big pike on a set line, and as he's finishing processing that pike and he heads back down to the river to clean his knife, he catches another large pike. So Dub's time on this episode ends with him having 3 very large fish hanging in front of his shelter. I mean, that is a lot of days worth of meat he has hanging there. He doesn't have to worry about it spoiling because it's cold and it will keep for a long time. So Dub finishes that episode looking really good. I'll say it again, food availability this season is phenomenal. You guys scared me. Jeez, a couple of squirrels just scared the heck out of me. They ran up behind me. What's wrong with me? I just got scared by 2 squirrels. Up next on episode 8 is Sarah. Now, I'm sure you've noticed, as I have, Sarah is not getting as much airtime as the other remaining contestants. I'm not exactly sure why. It could be to do with filming. It could be to do with she's not getting quite as much food as the other contestants, but I'm not quite sure what to make of that yet. Sarah talked to the camera a little bit about how this new snowfall really makes her miss home, because Alaska obviously has a lot of snow for a long period throughout the year. And then she starts having all these food fantasies, and don't get me started about food fantasies, because man, they are a powerful thing out there. So Sarah gets dressed, heads out, and starts looking for a fresh sign in the snow. So as Sarah's out and about, she notices a muskrat in her pond. I was kind of hoping that she was going to take a shot at that muskrat, but it didn't happen. She didn't find any fresh sign, and unfortunately, there was no fish on her set line. It did appear that Sarah only had 1 set line out in the water. I was wondering maybe it would be better if she had like a series of set lines along the river, trying some different spots. But then again, she probably doesn't have enough bait for that. And I was also wondering if she's trying hand lining. Now remember, the edit could cut a lot of that stuff out, but I was wondering if she had like built a hand line and constructed a lure and tried just casting and retrieving for the pike and other fish in that river, because they have shown other contestants catch fish using that method. Sarah starts talking about how she can feel her body is breaking down. Now, she's really proud of herself for all the food that she's been able to forage, and she's done a really good job with the foraging aspect of the game, but she's unable to get as much protein as her body needs, and she knows that she needs to procure some protein ASAP. Folks, thank you so much for tuning in to Tenta Outdoors. I will see you next Friday for episode 9 recap. We'll see you next time.